Hey knitters, welcome to episode 7 of Knit Talk with a Tech Editor. I'm Megan of the Unapologetic Knitter and I'm a tech editor. As you can probably hear, I'm a little bit hoarse today. I don't sound quite like myself. After an incredible visit with my sister and her nephew, I unfortunately got a bit of a cold, so bear with me. If there are some weird breaks in the video, it's because I've had to step away and have a little coughing fit, so bear with me. So today we're going to be talking about how to modify a pattern for gauge. In future episodes, we'll talk about how to apply these principles to garments, but today we're going to start out by focusing on a simpler shape like a beanie. So today we're going to be talking about, well, the beanie that I'm wearing and how to modify it for gauges so that you can get a hat that is as close as it can be to your desired size. Before we jump in, I just wanted to do a quick follow-up with any of you who followed my link in last episode to my free guide on my website about knitting your first sweater. I'd love to know what you thought of the guide, if you found the tips helpful, and if you've chosen a sweater pattern, or maybe you used the sweater pattern that was already included in the guide. I'm open to any feedback you have about that. And for those of you who didn't see last week's episode and don't know about this, you can head on over to unapologeticknitter.com/MFS, as in my first sweater, and you can download your free guide to learn more about what to look for and how to make the decision when you want to knit your very first sweater, because I know it can be a little bit much to think about. All right. So moving right ahead, let's talk about how we're going to use the learning hat pattern as an example to modify for gauge. We're going to be talking first and foremost about how to adjust for a larger gauge, and then we'll take a minute or two to talk about how to adjust for a slightly smaller gauge. So the original hat that I'm wearing here or here, we're knit up in a worsted weight yarn, and we're going to modify that for, the tag said bulky, but I think it's almost a super bulky. The gauge that I achieved with this yarn is 12 stitches and 16 rows over 4 inches. So it's a pretty thick yarn. And then we'll talk about how to make modifications for a fingering weight version as well, which I didn't knit up because that's a lot more stitches than I had time to knit in the last couple of weeks. All right, so taking a quick step backwards, I just want to reiterate something that I talked about, I think in episode 2. Our gauge directly impacts the size of a finished project, right? So if I said to you something like, the gauge is 20 stitches and 28 rows over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. If you were to knit a swatch and that was your gauge, and you knit it 20 stitches wide and 28 stitches tall, it should be 4 inches by 4 inches or 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters square. Okay, so the same is true of when you're knitting a project. Your gauge will directly reflect the size of the finished project. And so that's the theory that we're going to be talking about today. With that information, you'll be able to take any pattern that you have and make a comparable project at a different weight. And if you'll notice, I said comparable. I think it's comparable. Something really similar, but it may not be exactly the same. And the reason I say that is changing gauge and the number of stitches that you have to cast on to perhaps stay within a particular pattern repeat will affect the finished size of your project. So let's walk through this so you can see what I'm talking about. I just want to make it clear right up front that there are some limitations that may mean you won't get exactly the same size project when you adjust for gauge, but I think that'll be clearer as we move ahead. Okay, so I had some of this lovely bulky weight, non-superwash Icelandic yarn laying around. It was leftovers from a sweater that I knit a couple of weeks ago and I wore in episode 6. And I know that my gauge from that yarn on a US 11 needle is 12 stitches and 16 rounds over 4 inches. So I didn't even have to swatch for this hat. I already had the information available to me. Now, I know from the original pattern of the learning hat, and I'll throw a little schematic up here for you, that the finished circumference of the hat is 19 inches. So I want to take that information and figure out how many stitches I need to cast on for my hat. So I'm going to do this twice. I'm going to do this once in US units and once in metric units, and let's just jump right in. So starting with the US knitters, what we need to do is take our target circumference of the hat, which is 19 inches, and divide it by 4 because we measure our gauge over 4 inches. So 19 divided by 4 is 4.75. And next we have to take that result, the 4.75, and multiply it by our stitch gauge, which is 12. So 4.75 multiplied by 12 is 57. So that means we want to look at casting on 57 stitches to achieve a total finished circumference of 19 inches at our new project gauge, the bulky weight. Okay, for our metric knitters, you're going to do the same thing, but we're going to use metric numbers. So the finished circumference in metric as a conversion from 19 inches is 48.5 centimeters. So we will divide our 48.5 centimeter circumference, the target, by 10 because we measure our stitch gauge over 10 centimeters. And the result of that is 4.85. And now we're going to multiply that 4.85 by our stitch gauge, which is the same. It's still 12. So that 4.85 multiplied by 12 is 58.2. Okay, so for everybody who watched both the metric and the US unit conversion or adjustments that I just walked you through, did you notice a difference in the results? There surely is a difference, right? If you take the numbers directly from the US units, where we've got 19 inches and we want to convert it to stitches at our 12 stitches over 4 inches, it's 57 flat. There's no rounding. If you are doing the metric units and you're converting from 48.5 centimeters, you get 58.2 stitches. So there is a difference of 1 stitch there. So that difference in stitches is kind of a result of rounding. It's very hard to get a perfect round from inches to centimeters or centimeters to inches. So just keep in mind that you may get slightly different numbers, but the end result will be the same. So when we're adjusting a pattern for gauge, some concessions often have to be made from the original design to your adjusted design. One of the biggest ones, beyond just rounding numbers up and down when you're converting between metric and US, is stitch count repeats in a pattern. So in this original version of the hat, we've got a multiple of 4 stitches at the brim and in this lower portion of the pattern, and then we have a multiple of 2 stitches in sort of this upper portion of the pattern before we go to reverse stockinette stitch. So we first and foremost have to figure out what number of stitches we can cast on that will be a multiple of 2 and 4, so you're not really fudging numbers as you go through the project. So right off the bat with the 57 stitches, we can pretty much throw that out, right? We know that an odd number will never be evenly divisible by an even number, so 2 and 4 will definitely not divide evenly into 57 stitches. So that one's done. If we look at the option of casting on 58 stitches, it's definitely divisible by 2, but it's not divisible by 4. So we need to decide if we want to take our 58 stitches and round it down to 56 stitches, which is evenly divisible by 2 and 4, or round it up to 56 stitches, which is also divisible by 2 and by 4. Obviously, rounding down means your hat will be slightly smaller. Rounding up means your hat will be slightly larger than the target circumference that we originally had of 19 inches or 48.5 centimeters. So when it comes to deciding which way to go, you can start looking at the things that you know about how you like to wear hats. I like a snugger hat, so I would probably round down to 56 stitches rather than rounding up to the 60 stitches. And that's just a personal preference. I know that I like to wear a hat with approximately 3 inches of negative ease. If you have a desire for a slightly larger, slightly looser hat, you would want to round up to 60 stitches. If you don't know how you like a hat to fit, because maybe this is one of your first hats, you can do a little bit of sleuthing for yourself. So we're gonna grab our little sewer's tape measure, and you're gonna measure around what I call your hat line. So you wanna take your tape measure and wrap it around your head where you wear your hat, right? So it's not straight across here, it's going down at the angle where your hat brim is gonna be. And so this is reading at about 22.5 inches for me. But that's because I've got a hat on. I know my head is 22 inches around. And then you can look at the recommended ease in the pattern to decide what the best fit would be for you. The learning hat has a recommended ease of 0 to -4 inches or -10 centimeters of ease. So you want to knit a hat that is exactly the same size as your head or up to 4 inches or 10 centimeters smaller than that, which is a really big range. So if you have not knit a hat before, I would recommend that you go to your closet, your cubby. I don't know where you store your hats. We have ours in our front hall closet in a little cubby, and measure, pardon me, measure your commercial hat to figure out what the circumference of it is. When you know that, you can decide whether you want to go slightly larger or slightly smaller to get the hat that's going to fit you best. Okay, so now we've chosen whether we want to cast on 56 stitches or 60 stitches, which I would love to tell you you can just cast on, but guess what? You can't yet. I know, I'm sorry. This next bit should go fairly quickly. So there's 2 other things that you have to take into consideration. And of course, we're specifically talking about hats with this one, but it's kind of an indicator of what things you might need to look for in other patterns that you're going to modify for gauge. Okay, so let's talk about the crown shaping of the hat first. So when I look at the original hat pattern for the learning hat, we've got 8 decrease panels that work all the way around the round of the hat to take us from the full circumference down to the tippy top of the hat where we close it up. And that means, well, it means 2 things. It means that you decrease 8 stitches every time you work a decrease round, but it also means that our stitch count now needs to be divisible by 8. So before, where we were considering having a multiple of stitches that worked with both 2 and 4, and our 2 options were 56 stitches or 60 stitches, we now have to consider the crown shaping. And now we need it to be a multiple of 8 stitches as well. So now we have to do a bit more checking on what that's going to do to the circumference of our hat. So very conveniently, 56 stitches is divisible by 2, 4, and 8. So if you're okay having a slightly snugger hat than the 19 inches or 48.5 centimeters that we talked about as the finished circumference, you can go with 56 stitches. If you did not want a snugger hat, you now have to consider changing your stitch count from 60 up to 64 so that it's divisible by 2 and 4 for the brim and the pattern part of the hat, but also now 8 for the crown shaping. If you didn't want to modify it up to 64 stitches, because that would just make the hat too large for you, it would be around 21.25 inches or 53.5 centimeters. You would have to look at adjusting the rate of shaping in the crown. So now you're not only modifying the pattern for your gauge, but you're actually modifying the pattern's actual instructions. So That's not something we're going to talk about in this video specifically, but it is something that you can consider doing if your adjustments to stitch counts are getting a little bit too out of control. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about row gauge. So for this super bulky sample, I know that my row gauge is 16 stitches over 4 inches. And I know from the original pattern or the schematic that the target height of the hat, sort of laid flat, like if you were to measure straight down the hat, is 8.5 inches or 21.5 centimeters. So now what we need to do is look at the depth that we're going to have to work the reverse stockinette section of the hat before we work any crown shaping. In the original pattern, the crown shaping was 2.5 inches long, so you knit the hat from the cast on edge to 6 inches in length, where the differential between the stitch pattern and the reverse stockinette stitch was, like, that's where you make up the difference, right? So you would work your total number of rows of ribbing and stitch pattern, and when you stopped it, you worked just reverse stockinette stitch all the way until you started the crown shaping. And we're gonna try and do the exact same thing here, but because we've got a taller row gauge, we'll have fewer rounds to work. So, I won't go into all of the details of how I know this, but assuming you cast on a 56 stitch hat, we will have 11 decrease rounds in the crown to go from our 56 stitches up to the 8 stitches at the very top of the hat. I will get the numbers up on the screen for you so you can see what it should look like, but I won't explain to you all the math of it right now. So now we know that between the end of the reverse stockinette stitch and our crown, with all the shaping, we have to work 11 rounds. So let's talk about the math of that a little bit. It's going to feel a little bit repetitive, but I'm going to go through it for both US and metric. So we're going to take our 11 rounds and divide it by our row gauge, which is 16. This is the same for both sets of units. And the resulting number is roughly 0.7. I'll have this up on the screen for you. It's 0.6875. So now you're going to take that resulting number, the 0.6875, and multiply it by 4, because we measure our row gauge over 4 inches and we get 2.75. So that means that the total height of our crown shaping, starting, of course we won't see it here, starting from here to the top of the crown is 2.75 inches, okay? If we were doing this in metric, it would be very, very similar. We're gonna take the 11 rounds and divide it by our row gauge, which is 16, and we get the same 0.6875. But instead of multiplying it by 4, we're going to multiply it by 10 because we measure our centimeters, or pardon me, our row gauge over 10 centimeters, and the result is 6.875 centimeters, or 7 centimeters, or just below. So now that we know that our crown shaping is approximately 2.75 inches long, tall, 2.75 inches tall, or just shy of 7 centimeters, we're going to take that number and subtract it from the total target height of the hat. So we're going to take our 8.5 inches and subtract 2.75, which is 5.75, or we'll take our 21.5 centimeters and subtract our 7 centimeters, which is 14.5 centimeters. So that means when we are done our ribbing and our stitch patterns and we go to just our reverse stockinette stitch, we're gonna knit until the length of that hat is 5.75 inches or 14.5 centimeters, and then we'll begin the crown shaping. Okay, so now you could cast on your hat. You know that the stitch count has to be a multiple of 2, 4, and 8, and you know how many rounds you would need to finish your crown shaping so that you can figure out your stopping point. And that's it. So now you can knit a hat. Okay, had to go have a little coughing fit there. Sorry, folks. Okay, so now we'll just touch really briefly on what you would look for if you were trying to make the hat at a smaller gauge. Smaller gauge. So if you wanted to go the opposite direction and make your hat in fingering weight instead of like a super bulky weight, all of the same math is going to apply. You're going to have to figure out how many stitches you need to cast on to reach your target circumference. You're going to want to determine how deep your crown shaping will need to be based on the number of rounds you work. And I'll put a little formula on how to figure that out so that you don't have to guess. And then you'll have to figure out your stopping point based on the depth of your crown shaping. So there's not a whole lot to discuss there without sort of repeating all of the math that we've just done. But I think the thing that's important to consider when you're going down in size with your gauge is the different impacts that the stitch counts will have. So for example, when you're working at a super bulky weight yarn like this, rounding from 58 stitches down to 56 stitches can have a pretty significant impact on your gauge. So changing those 2 stitches from 58 to 56 is about 5/8 of an inch or just shy of 2 centimeters. So you're taking off a pretty significant, I'm sorry, my husband just texted through. I didn't mean for that to be on. I apologize. So you're making a pretty significant difference in the circumference when you're working at a larger gauge. When you're working at a smaller gauge, the circumference differential is smaller, right? Rounding up or down by let's say 2 stitches will only impact your work, say 1/4 of an inch or, like 1 centimeter, not even like a 1/2 centimeter. But you'll have to work a lot more rounds to finish the crown shaping because you've got so many stitches to make up your circumference and you've got so many to decrease up to the crown that working them at the same interval of 8 stitches decreased each decrease round means you're going to have a much deeper crown. So in that case, you would probably look at increasing the number of stitches that you work on a decrease round. To use this hat as an example, instead of decreasing having 8 decrease panels all the way around, you might consider decreasing 16 stitches all the way around. So you have to look at how those numbers will line up so that you don't end up with crown shaping that starts like all the way down here. When I did the math, because I just sort of did the math really quickly to see what it would look like to knit the hat at fingering weight, it worked out that the crown shaping was going to be like 4 inches. And so you'd only have 4.5 inches of hat in pattern before you had to start decreasing if you maintained the 8 stitch decrease on the crown. So there are some little things that you need to consider when you're adjusting for gauge so that you don't get partway through and then go, oh my gosh, I still have 4 inches of crown shaping to knit. So you just want to take that into consideration. Okay, so let's wrap it all up. I'll start by saying that I hope you enjoyed today's kind of quick and dirty little tutorial talking about how to modify a project for gauge. Obviously today's was very specific, talking about hats, but it lays the groundwork for a future episode where I will talk about how to take the same concept of changing the gauge for a project and applying it to a garment, because I know that there's a lot of people that see garments at one weight and want to knit it at another weight. There's lots of little things to look out for, so we'll talk about that in a future episode. But just to let you know, next week, Wednesday, April 19th, that's crazy. Okay, it'll be a technique tutorial focusing on the different methods for joining your work in the round right after you cast on. I'm gonna have 3 different methods for you, and I'm really curious to get your feedback on whether you love them or hate them or which one you like the most. And then in 2 weeks' time, the next Knit Talk episode, I'm going to be talking to you about picking up and knitting stitches along the edge of a project and how to figure out the best ratio for you and your work to make sure you don't get puckering around an edge. And if you enjoy these videos, I would really love for you to subscribe to my channel so you get a notification every time a new video comes out. We have wanna learn something Wednesday, so every Wednesday I've got new content for you to learn a new skill. And if you have ideas for future topics, please feel free to send in a submission form. I get a couple every week, and I absolutely love seeing what your ideas are and turning them into tutorials so that we can learn together. I do see all of them, and I try to reply to as many of them as I can just to let you know that I've seen them. If you don't get a reply right away, I'm sorry. I got sick last week. It was so hard, but I just want to let you know that I do see them and I take them into consideration, and I can't wait to get through all of them. It'll take potentially years. If you are on Instagram or Facebook, because I know we don't all use every single platform, I would love for you to connect with me on Instagram. I am at NotSorryKnitter, and I would love to see projects that you have used or completed based on the tutorials, or even just things that you're really excited about. Use hashtag Unapologetic Knitter, because I think everybody should be an unapologetic knitter and I want to see what you're working on. And on Facebook, of course, I am the Unapologetic Knitter. You can join us over there if you'd like. I think those two options, Facebook and Instagram, are just kind of a fun way for us to share some of our personal stuff outside of the business of knitting, right? All right, so thank you guys so much for being here this week, and thank you for your patience with me, as I'm sure there are pieces of the video that are a little choppy as I had coughing fits, but I look forward to seeing you again soon, and happy knitting.